Welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Matt Manocherian, former NFL scout and currently of Sports Info Solutions, joined by Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders, the OG father of football analytics in the modern era. Can I say that? Is that embarrassing you if I introduce you like that?
No, I'm proud to be the godfather of football analytics in the modern era. I'm no Bud Good as far as the old school era, but yeah, I mean, I think that Football Outsiders basically started things in 2003, so I'm good with that.
Right. Bill James, Dean Oliver, Aaron Schatz. I'm lucky to be on with you. So let's get right into things today. We're going to have a quick off-season episode, keeping these things kind of moving along as we have been. We got to start off talking about the Raiders. The Raiders, one of the most interesting teams in football right now. I think just trying to figure out what they're doing from a team-building perspective. Obviously, the 10-year plan is something that I think we would both be in favor of, loving the idea of having that kind of time. But here we are a year and a little bit into it, and it's hard to make sense of exactly what's going on. And of course, we've got to talk about this signing of Richie Incognito, because they make the deal for Antonio Brown, of course. Then they bring in Vontaze Burfict. Now Richie Incognito. It seems like it's almost getting to a level of absurdity and kind of what are they doing in that locker room right now? Well, what's your take on all this?
It's hard for me to tell if Antonio Brown's locker room issues are really of a kind with, I mean, all the locker room issues for those guys are sort of different issues. I mean, I don't think anybody's ever accused Antonio Brown of being a dirty player, for example.
Right. He's more like the Randy Moss type example to me. Like you could see people having, okay, they call him a diva, whatever else it is, but very hard worker. You could see him coming into the right situation and actually being a leader in a lot of ways. That's kind of like, but Burfict and Incognito both have dirty reputations.
Yeah, and they said something during the draft about the attempt of drafting guys based on character. So that seems to be out the window. I mean, I guess that only applied for the draft for something to tell the press. But, I mean, obviously they've made a ton of changes this offseason. They've got a lot of new guys on that team this year. I have no idea how that locker room is. I don't claim to be an expert on how locker rooms coalesce. If I was, I would call myself football psychiatrists instead of football outsiders.
I thought you were going to say football insiders. I didn't see football psychiatrists coming.
But I mean, you got to think they're starting an almost entirely new wide receiver core, 2 new offensive linemen. They've got 3 first or second round rookies on defense, plus Burfict, Brandon Marshall. It's a lot of changes.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you bring in Burfict and Incognito, and especially bringing in Incognito after kind of OTAs have already started. To me, that's Gruden taking a look at his team and saying, we're not tough enough. We need to get more toughness in here. Maybe he thinks they brought in too much character. And we're over focused on that in the draft, and he wants some 1-year guys in there that are going to stir the pot. But
if Incognito plays the way he did before he quote unquote retired, he's a better guard than the guy they had at the position before that. So I mean, they had Denzel Good, who's kind of a journeyman. So I mean, it's also an attempt to just improve the quality of the team, assuming Incognito is going to be as good after a year off and 2 years older.
Well, so I'm a little bit more in line with the thought that I think he's kind of going to be blocking somebody young from getting in there that should really probably be growing into that role, and you should be developing an offensive line more so than trying to fill a gap with somebody like this. He's 35 already? So, I mean, I think when you look at the offensive line, you think this is a Tom Cable offensive line. They're going to want to have lots of athletic guys out there. They trade Kelechi Assembly for a 5th-round pick. Didn't really make sense to me, but you're thinking, okay, maybe there's some sort of a plan that they have in mind here. Then they turn right around and they bring in Trent Brown and now Richie Incognito. These aren't exactly fleet of foot guys that you're talking about here, your prototypical zone-blocking offensive linemen. It's hard to figure out what the big plan is. And, I mean, we haven't mentioned it yet, but Incognito, 3 really bizarre incidents relatively recently. Just to go down the line, he was cited for an incident in a gym last May in which he threw tennis balls at other patrons and threw a dumbbell into the pool. Normal behavior. Then he threatened to shoot a group of people at a funeral home in Arizona where his father was buried, after which he had an arsenal of weapons seized. And then finally, most recently, he gets into an argument with his 90-year-old grandmother, which results in him being arrested. And then the next time we hear about him, it's that he's coming back into the NFL. It feels like, maybe they're trying to get tougher, but the Raiders offseason, more than anything, it reminds me of the Lakers offseason last year, where you thought that, okay, we were expecting to see some sort of a plan come together right now, but the plan seems to be to do what makes the least sense from a basketball or football perspective. We're bringing in these oversized offensive linemen. We're trying to bring in character guys at the same time as bringing in Vontaze Burfict and Richie Incognito. It's a lot of things that it's hard to make a sense of, even if you give them the benefit of the doubt. These are short-term deals. The real test is a year from now. I just don't understand how you would put this strategy together. How do you understand what these moves are going on in conjunction with one another? And I have a lot of respect for John Gruden. He's somebody that I've met a few times, and he would come when we were in New Orleans and sit in on our draft room every once in a while because he was close with Sean Payton. And I think he's a really intelligent guy. I think he's absolutely magnetic in the way that he leads people. But this is really weird, and it's just hard to add these all together. And I think a year from now, we might be sitting and maybe it's a Magic Johnson situation with Mike Mayock, where he says, I wasn't given the power that I thought I was going to get here. There is no coherent plan. I'm out. Like it feels like that to me.
I will say, as far as Incognito blocking young linemen, there are no young linemen to be blocked. If you look at the Raiders' depth chart, they took no offensive linemen in the draft this year. Last year, they took Colton Miller. He's a starter, obviously. And they took a third-round pick named Brandon Parker, who's now blocked by Trent Brown because he's a tackle also. And I suppose you could move him into guard if you wanted to have a young lineman. But there's no, late-round developmental lineman in Oakland for Incognito to really be blocking. Just journeyman backups like Jordan Devey and Denzel Good.
So I guess they're just filling in the gaps for another year. It's almost like, if that's how you're looking at it, then it's kind of like they're tanking until they get to Vegas.
Or at least maybe they feel like they want to go veteran on the offensive line and younger at the other positions, right? Like, look at where they've concentrated their draft picks over the last couple of years, primarily defense, right? I mean, they've taken a couple of offensive guys, but primarily they've been drafting on defense. Last year it was Arden Key and Maurice Hurst. And then this year it was Cleveland Farrell, and then there are a couple of defensive backs in the first and second round, and then another defensive end named Max with two X's Crosby.
Can you build a football team ignoring the offensive line in the draft?
That's the thing, is in the long run. I mean, they're not ignoring it because they took Colton Miller, but for the most part, they're going veteran there, and they're not ignoring it. Look at all the money they just gave to Trent Brown. I just think maybe they think they want to go more veteran. What I don't understand is saving money by trading Osemele after you just spent all that money on Brown. Osemele is pretty good. Right.
Well, it doesn't make any sense to me, honestly. I think that you had a guy under contract that's a good player for you. Trade him away for a fifth-round pick, get not much in return. By signing Trent Brown, you didn't give anything up, but the Patriots earned a third-round pick just for having him on a one-year deal, and you're going to end up paying, I forget what the contract, but it's like 4-year deal, paying him over $15 million a year, I think. So that's a lot of money to invest right there. Just the inconsistencies, that's what gets me with it. One thing I didn't realize that when George Lee left the Raiders, we thought that this was, Gruden, he was bad-mouthing analytics. I didn't realize they actually still do have an analytics guy on staff who just recently was promoted to their director of football analytics, a guy named David Kristoff. And he's been with them for 5 years, been their director of player analytics since 2017. He came from an independent sports analysis firm called InSourceSports.com, and also came from the MIT Sloan School of Management. So this is an intelligent guy. I wonder exactly what sort of fingerprints he has on this. I wonder if he's being given any sort of power here and being empowered kind of in this process. And maybe there's something going on behind the scenes that maybe if we had the sorts of insights that they had, maybe these moves would make more sense than they seem to on the surface.
Well, one thing we've learned is that having an analytics guy on staff doesn't necessarily mean that A, the analytics guy is listened to much, or B, that the analytics guy necessarily agrees with the larger analytics community. I mean, we think of the Patriots as a pretty forward analytics team, but they went and drafted a running back in the first round last year. Seattle has analytics people on staff. They went and drafted a running back in the first round last year. And what did Oakland do this year? Drafted a running back in the first round. So, just because there are analytics people doesn't mean that a team is going to be doing things in a sort of analytics style direction. Heck, even the Eagles drafted a running back high this year.
Right. And I mean, I agree with your point, because focusing in on the running backs really does show you some of the kind of what the analytics community as a whole thinks versus what individual analysts might think. There can be some divergence of thought there. And also, what the value of a first round pick is, what the value of a late first round pick is, and having a running back on the first 4 years of their career as opposed to having second contract running backs. I think looking at the Eagles and what they've been able to do in terms of just not paying running backs is something that I really appreciate. And then something that you see there is certainly from the ownership down, an interest in analytics and something that permeates through the organization, as opposed to, just having one guy on staff doesn't actually mean that person's empowered at all.
Right. I mean, the 49ers, right? That's another team that we think of as being analytics forward. But clearly, whoever's doing analytics for them is not impacting too much their signings, because they have the most salary cap space spent at the running back position of any team in the NFL.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's also it's hard to imagine Kyle Shanahan really deferring to the analysts about something like that. So it's interesting. We'll see how that continues to develop in the years to come, because we've seen how it's gone down in baseball and we've seen how it's gone down in basketball. And as more and more teams keep winning with these strategies, I think we're going to see more and more of the empowerment of this throughout the NFL.
But I will say, as far as the Raiders go, I mean, you've got to expect some improvement this year. There is a lot of young talent there. One of the things that we found is that young drafted talent on defense has a more predictable immediate return than the predictable return of offensive draftees. So the fact that they took the 3 different defensive players in the first 2 rounds is a little bit of a sort of positive indicator for their defense. The problem the Raiders have is right now, in our current projections, we have them with the 3rd hardest schedule in the league.
Yeah, the Raiders, just came across that they are 6 wins is their over under for this year from Vegas. And that seems pretty spot on to me, honestly. I do think that they brought in a bunch of players, but I don't know how much of a team they've really built. So I'm still skeptical about a lot of things with the Raiders in terms of what to expect from them this year. I think that seems like a fair line to me. Do you come out thinking that you'd come in over for them?
6.1. So no, I think six wins is about as accurate as you can get. I mean, they could be a better team, but because of that schedule, still be a losing team.
If they manage to win 6.1 games this year, I will be really, really impressed. The Godfather, indeed. All right, let's take a step forward and let's hear. You did some research about pressure numbers with and without pressure, and I want to hear about what sort of research you put together there. So take it away.
So this is something that usually ends up in an article on Football Outsiders during the offseason. But if you're listening to the podcast, you're going to get a little bit of a preview of looking at yards per play, net yards per pass, including scrambles, or DVOA with and without pressure. Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. Start with, let's look at quarterbacks, right? Research that we've done and research that PFF has done, we've both looked at it and shown that performance under pressure is much less consistent from year to year than performance with no pressure. So when you find quarterbacks who are particularly strong under pressure, you would expect them to decline the following year. I mean, the best example of this is the second best quarterback with pressure in 2017 was Case Keenum. And of course, Case Keenum, yes, did decline. And that was like part of the Case Keenum weird outlier year that he had in 2017. So who's the best quarterback with pressure in 2018? Well, it's Patrick Mahomes, but that's not anything to be worried about because who's the best quarterback without pressure in 2018? Is Patrick Mahomes, right? So, Patrick Mahomes was good at pretty much everything last year. But the next two guys down, so these are guys who have the smallest gap last year between their performance with pressure and their performance without pressure, and were the highest guys with pressure other than Mahomes, were Jameis Winston and Mitchell Trubisky. And I think that that's an indicator that they're both. That's a downward indicator for both of those guys.
You said those guys with pressure were very good last year, so you're saying that you expect them to regress in terms of their overall numbers this year?
Yep. In terms of DVOA, that's the second and third best quarterbacks in the league with pressure.
Wow.
And in terms of net yards per pass, they're the second and fourth quarterbacks in the league with pressure. The leading quarterback in net yards per pass was Nick Foles, but of course that's with a smaller sample size, and his DVOA was not as high as his net yardage. He must have just had a couple of really big plays with pressure that because he only had 200 plays, that they have an outsized effect on the average.
So interesting you brought up kind of the leaderboards, because as you were talking about that, I took a look at total points and how the guys stacked up throughout 2018. And actually, in terms of without pressure, we had one guy who outpaced even Patrick Mahomes in terms of points earned. On 372 attempts, Patrick Mahomes had 86.7 points earned with no pressure. On 373 attempts, so one more attempt, Drew Brees had 100.2 points earned with no pressure last year, including a 62% positive play rate. That's our version of EPA-based success rate. So Drew Brees was the guy for us that showed that. And I think that makes sense if you think about it. Those two guys last year were just absolutely above and beyond everywhere else. You mentioned Trubisky. He's down at 35th in terms of total points with pressure. In fact, Chase Daniel created more total points without pressure than Mitchell Trubisky did last year on 52 attempts as opposed to 325.
Yeah, I will say, first of all, as far as with no pressure, we have Brees a little lower in DVOA, but if you look at the top quarterbacks without pressure last year, it is mostly a list of who you would generally think of as the top quarterbacks in the league. Mahomes, Rivers, Wilson, Aaron Rodgers, then Jared Goff, thank you, structure, and then Ryan Fitzpatrick, who had a crazy year where he was really good at times. And then Drew Brees, and then Nick Mullins, but then Matt Ryan and Tom Brady. So other than Fitzpatrick and Mullins and maybe Goff, and with Goff you can really see it's because of the structure of the Rams offense, this is basically a list of who we all consider as the top quarterbacks in the league.
Yep, absolutely. I think that makes sense. And I always keep going back to, we look at with and without pressure, and in terms of understanding that, it's not to say that without pressure numbers are necessarily more important than with pressure numbers. I think a lot of time you really care about how a quarterback performs under pressure. What this is really isolating is how well the passing offense of the team performs. Because really, when we're looking at these quarterback statistics, a lot of times what we're looking at, you look at something like DVOA or net yards per attempt, it's really an evaluation of how good the entire passing game is, which often comes back down to the quarterback, as rightfully it should. But so it does make sense that when you don't have pressure, you're going to see more consistent numbers from year to year because you're removing more variables from the play. You're saying, okay, when they get a clean drop back, what's going on here? How well does the offense function when it's not under pressure? So it makes sense that it's stickier in that sense. I think it's probably a little bit more valuable for that reason, but it's not to say that the under pressure stuff is valueless.
Well, you're right, but it's predictability, right? It's that the no pressure numbers are more predictable from year to year than the with pressure numbers. And so the guys who are really good with no pressure, it's easier to predict that they're going to be really good the following year. And the guys who are not very good with pressure. For example, Josh Rosen, I mean, you want to talk about how everything was bad in Arizona. He had the worst DVOA in the league, both with and without pressure. He was the only quarterback with a negative DVOA with no pressure. But then if you –
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, they were just looking at just the rest of the bottom of the league. It's like Blake Bortles, Josh Allen, Foles, and surprisingly Matthew Stafford, and then Case Keenum. So, like, those are the bottom quarterbacks with no pressure, and those are the quarterbacks who had really bad years for the most part. Stafford's sort of an interesting one to have in there.
Yeah. So, and again, what I wanted to remind and kind of go back to was when you talk about those numbers, when you talk about how poor Josh Rosen was last year, you're talking about how poor the Arizona offense, passing offense was with him playing quarterback last year. Really, that's what DVOA is measuring, right? How good was the offense above or below average in this situation, given X, Y, and Z. So for us, yes, we saw negative 57 expected points added on Josh Rosen passes under pressure last year, but only -1 of that was attributed to him in terms of total points. So when we look at kind of the greater formula, what we're finding is, no, he didn't perform well, but a lot of it was what was going on around him, the ridiculous number of blown blocks that you had around him, the kind of difficult situations that he was put in where he basically performed exactly as we expected him to perform, exactly as we'd expect an average quarterback to perform. It was just he was in that horrible a situation. Which is a little bit different than looking at somebody like Nathan Peterman, who, negative 32 expected points added on his 24 pass attempts under pressure, but negative 19 of that is attributed to him, a much higher percentage of it. Similar story with Tyrod Taylor.
Here, just to tie back to the Raiders, just to finish up, by the way, the biggest gap in DVOA between pressure and no pressure belonged to Derek Carr, who with pressure was the second worst quarterback in the league in DVOA, and without pressure was actually 11th. So perhaps that is a positive sign for what the Raiders could do this year. The problem is it's only really a positive. I mean, it's, Carr's performance with pressure is going to be more inconsistent. So Carr will probably be better this year when he's under pressure. The problem is he's under pressure a lot.
Yep.
The offensive line for the Raiders has really declined from where it was a couple of years ago.
And that's one of those tricky things about just looking at these pressure stats, is that we always have to take into account that a lot of times the quarterback is responsible for the pressure themselves. We found that about 50% of pressure is predicted by just who the quarterback is in general. So it has something to do with them for sure.
True. I think with the Raiders, it's more the offensive line, just because their pressure numbers have changed so much over the last couple of years with the same quarterback.
Right. And certainly with the scheme changing too, that's going to have to do with it. But it's tricky because you look at, okay, this guy performed really well under pressure, but how often were they under pressure is another part of the equation that's really important to consider as well.
Right. So like Tom Brady last year with pressure fell substantially from where he had been the year before with pressure. But the Patriots allow so little pressure compared to other teams, and part of that is Brady's doing himself. But because of that, they're not in that bad situation anywhere near as often as a team like, say, Houston, right? Where Deshaun Watson is pretty good under pressure compared to other quarterbacks, but he's still better without pressure. And golly, do they allow a lot of pressure.
Yep, absolutely. All right, started talking about defense a little bit. Let's flip it on its head, and I want to hear what you found when you started to looking into different defenses with and without pressure. What did you learn there?
This is interesting, too, because I think that this helps tell a story about which defenses are getting more value out of their coverage versus who are getting more value out of their pass rush. And the top defenses when there's no pass pressure last year in DVOA were Baltimore, Buffalo, Chicago, Indianapolis, and Denver.
Teams that we think of as having good pass defenses.
Yes, teams that we think of for the most part of having good secondaries. I don't think Indianapolis' secondary is well known. Chicago was like the best defense or close to the best defense, both with and without pressure. So that's not a big deal. That the worst defense with no pressure was Tampa Bay.
Interesting.
And we know that their secondary has been a bit of a wreck. Also down at the bottom of the league, Detroit, Pittsburgh, right, which was overall a pretty good defense, but that was because they brought the pass rush. San Francisco and Carolina, and then Atlanta, which had all the injuries in their secondary.
Right. So it sounds, again, just like kind of stripping things out. It's a pretty good measure of kind of how good the defense was overall. You know, looking into kind of the total points rankings, when we look at the defense, the teams that you mentioned as being these good defenses when they don't have pressure, those sound like the teams that are the good defenses overall.
Right. Now, I mean, the difference is a team that is not as good with pressure was Indianapolis, right? So Indianapolis had one of the league's smallest gaps between its DVOA with pressure and DVOA without pressure. So that really suggests that the secondary, when the secondary had time, that they actually were, you know, when the quarterback had time, the secondary was actually better than you would expect. But for some reason, when they got pass pressure, they weren't as good as some of these other defenses like Denver or Chicago.
Well, it probably has to do with how they're built. You know, they're really built as a real zone scheme type team, sitting back a lot of that time, whether it be cover 3 or cover 2, doing the different things that you see the Colts do. Being in that zone a lot of the time, though, not bringing a whole lot of pressure, being kind of their MO, it makes sense that, you know, you think about the old school bend but don't break style defense. That's what they're doing there. They're sitting in, they're playing their responsibilities. They're doing what they're supposed to do, and not necessarily trying to force the issue with you so much as just, you know, do a really great job at all the things they're doing. So as a team that doesn't really, you know, want to bring pressure, it's not a big part of their MO. I think it makes sense to see that they're kind of being rational in the way that they're scheming things up.
And, of course, it's interesting. The worst defense with pressure was also the defense that brought by far the least amount of pressure, which was Oakland. When they brought pass pressure, Oakland allowed a positive DVOA, the only team in the league, and they allowed 6.8 yards per pass when no other team was above 5.4. And that was when they actually brought pressure.
Yep, bringing it back to the Raiders, they're also last in the NFL in points earned on defense last year, in pass defense points earned, rather, I should say. So no surprise there. They outpaced even the Cardinals and the Giants in terms of their ineptitude in defending the pass. So I think it all adds up. Like you mentioned before, though, hopefully a lot of the investments they've made on the defensive side of the ball will start to pan out, and we'll start to see what year 2 of the 10-year plan has in store.
Yeah, we didn't even mention, as far as all of their additions on defense, we didn't even mention LaMarcus Joyner. I mean, they added a guy who was a franchise player a year ago, and they've added him to their secondary. So it should be an improved defense if they can get to the quarterback. The problem is, the question is sort of like, are they right about Cleveland Farrell, or is our projections right about Cleveland Farrell that we have him as not as good as they think he is? I mean, we still have him as good, but not as much going to have as a first-year impact as much as the Raiders probably expect that he's going to have.
Right. I mean, I think there are certain players that they could have taken at that spot where I would have been saying, oh, man, this guy's juicy double-digit sack numbers. I wouldn't be shocked if Farrell got to double digits, but I mean, I would expect somewhere in the 5 to 10 range to probably be more realistic expectation with him. If he does get to that double-digit range, it's either because they really worked hard to scheme him into situations where he could succeed, or they're just geniuses and they got it right and we all were wrong.
Or sacks are just more inconsistent than we tend to believe, because one of the things that, you know, is interesting is that sack rates from year to year are actually fairly inconsistent. Pressure rates from year to year are much more consistent than sack rates. But of course, the Raiders were at the bottom of the league in pressure last year too. So.
Right. Sacks don't happen very often. Pressures happen more often. They're going to be a little bit more stable over time. That's a big reason why we like them. You make a good point there. Let's look at Cleveland Farrell. Let's look at his pressure numbers, not just his sack numbers, and see how well he plays, you know, on all aspects of what they're asking him to do. All right, Aaron, let's get out of here. Let's keep it quick in the off season. Is there anything that you wanted to plug before we sign off?
Mostly at Football Outsiders, we are still just plugging away on the book and the Kubiak projections, which should be out in early July as usual. So just hold your horses, and we'll get those out for everybody in about a month.
We're definitely looking forward to it. And same thing over here. We are in off-season mode. We are deep into a lot of different
baseball mode.
Well, we're in baseball mode around here for sure. We're in season in baseball mode, but on the research side, we're definitely digging into a lot of our off-season projects and really hoping that we can get everything into where we want it to be for next year. We have a lot of new things that we're working on, a lot of different kind of tools, some for teams, some more on the public side, which we should have more news on them soon. In the meantime, you mentioned the baseball, and I should mention, please check out Mark Simon's SIS Baseball podcast. I had a lot of fun working with him on it this week. And it's really excellent stuff. He is polished. He spent years on Baseball Tonight with ESPN, so he knows exactly what he's doing. He has some phenomenal guests on, and I hope we can continue to learn from him and try to get better, because what he's doing over there, I think, is really awesome stuff. So check out the SIS Baseball podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening, and we will be back next week. I will have Neil Stratton of Inside the League on. We're going to talk about how some different teams are structured and the different sorts of ways that teams build their personnel departments and structure themselves. So we'll have Neil Stratton of Inside the League on next week, and then we'll be back with Aaron after that, kind of continuing our trip around the offseason and keeping up on the latest stories. Please remember to like us, rate us, review us, subscribe, all that good stuff. And I'll be back next week with Neil.